Margaret Chen stood at the entrance of the Crystal Palace ballroom, her worn denim jacket pulled tight against the December wind that followed her through the revolving doors. Her canvas sneakers, split along the sides, left damp prints on the pristine marble as she shifted her weight from foot to foot. The backpack on her shoulders held everything she owned, its straps frayed from months of constant use. The ballroom stretched before her like a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across tables draped in silk, where guests in evening wear moved with the confidence of those who belonged. Margaret didn't belong here, and everyone could see it. Her dark hair, pulled back with a rubber band, framed a face marked by months of sleeping rough, but her eyes held a clarity that seemed to see through the glittering facade. She approached the event coordinator, a thin man in a pressed suit who clutched his tablet like a shield. "I can play one song for a meal," she said, her voice steady despite the hunger gnawing at her stomach. The coordinator blinked, then let out a short laugh. "Ma'am, this is a private charity auction. You can't just—" "Did someone leave the back door open?" The voice cut through the ambient chatter. Harrison Blake, the evening's host and real estate mogul, strode toward them with the authority of a man accustomed to removing obstacles. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo tailored to emphasize his imposing frame. Security should have caught this before she made it inside. A woman at a nearby table, her neck adorned with emeralds that caught the light, turned to her companions with theatrical disgust. "Look at those shoes," she said, loud enough to ensure Margaret heard. "Someone should call sanitation." Margaret's fingers tightened on her backpack straps, but her expression remained unchanged. She'd heard worse, she'd survived worse. The hotel manager, David Ross, materialized beside Harrison, his smile sharp as a blade. "This is a $5,000 a plate event," he said to Margaret. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." 5,000? A young man in a velvet dinner jacket held up his phone, already recording. "Guys, we've got a homeless woman trying to crash the richest party in Chicago." This is going viral. The crowd began to circle, some laughing, others filming. A server carrying champagne flutes paused nearby, her young face twisted with sympathy. The name tag on her uniform read Sarah. She was maybe 20, with kind eyes that reminded Margaret of someone she'd lost long ago. "Don't give up," Sarah whispered as she passed, slipping a dinner roll from her tray into Margaret's hand. Margaret pocketed the bread without breaking eye contact with Harrison. "Just one song," she repeated. "Street performers belong on the street," Harrison announced to the crowd, drawing appreciative laughter. "Though I suppose if you want to earn that meal, you could start by mopping the floor you've already dirtied." A man in an expensive watch tossed a napkin at Margaret's feet. "There's your start," he said, grinning at his own cruelty. Margaret bent slowly, picked up the napkin, and folded it with deliberate care. She placed it back on his table and met his gaze. "Your generosity is overwhelming," she said, her tone so even it took a moment for the sarcasm to register. The man's grin faltered as nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Near the stage, an old upright piano sat abandoned, overshadowed by the gleaming Steinway grand that dominated the center of the room. The Steinway was cordoned off with velvet ropes, its surface so polished it reflected the chandeliers like a dark mirror. Margaret walked to the upright and pressed middle C. The note rang clear despite the instrument's obvious age, its resonance filling the corners of the vast room. The sound seemed to expand beyond its physical limitations, rich with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from such a humble instrument. The chatter died. A musician from the evening's hired quartet, a woman with calloused fingers and the lean build of someone who'd spent years in practice rooms, straightened in her chair. "That's not amateur technique," she murmured to her colleague. "Listen to the sustain control." An elderly man near the back, his program folded and refolded from nervous habit, tilted his head. His eyes, sharp despite his age, narrowed as he studied Margaret. Something about her posture, the way she held her hands. "One note proves nothing," Harrison declared, his voice carrying across the room. "Touch that Steinway, and you'll be paying for damages until you're dead." "She probably can't even read music," a woman in diamonds sneered. "This is embarrassing for everyone." The MC, a smooth-talking man with perfectly capped teeth, saw an opportunity. "Tell you what, lady, make someone in this room cry with your playing, and I'll comp your meal for a week." "Better yet," Harrison's voice boomed, "make the whole room cry, and I'll donate 100,000 to tonight's charity. But when you fail, you're banned from every establishment I own in this city." The crowd erupted in cheers and bets. Phones came out again, recording what they expected to be spectacular failure. Margaret looked at the Steinway, then back at the crowd. Without a word, she ducked under the velvet rope and sat at the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and then she began to play. The melody started simply, a folk tune that seemed to rise from some deep, forgotten place. Her left hand laid down a gentle foundation, while her right traced a line that spoke of longing, of loss, of love, persisting against impossible odds. The technique was flawless, each note precisely weighted, the pedaling creating layers of sound that transformed the simple tune into something profound. This wasn't just music. This was storytelling without words, a narrative that spoke of rain-soaked bus stations and empty rooms, of promises kept in darkness and dreams deferred but never abandoned. The melody shifted and evolved, each variation revealing new depths of emotion. The teenager with the phone lowered it, his mouth slightly open. Sarah, still holding her tray, felt tears beginning to blur her vision. An older server, his uniform showing the wear of decades in service, stopped his work entirely. His eyes glistened as he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. The music built, not in volume but in intensity, each phrase more achingly beautiful than the last. Margaret's hands moved with an almost supernatural grace, coaxing sounds from the Steinway that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the heart. When she paused, letting a single chord hang in the crystalline air, the silence was absolute. A woman in the back pressed her hand to her mouth, mascara beginning to streak down her cheeks. A man in an expensive suit wiped his eyes with his sleeve, his embarrassment forgotten in the face of what he'd just experienced. That's impossible," the quartet's pianist whispered. "The touch, the interpretation—" "I know that style." The elderly man with the program was fumbling for his phone, his hands shaking as he scrolled through old photos. His face had gone pale. "Pathetic," a young woman in designer silk announced, though her voice lacked conviction. "My nephew plays better at his school recitals." Margaret's hands paused on the keys. She turned slightly, just enough to meet the woman's gaze. "Your nephew must be exceptional," she said quietly. The words carried no mockery, only a gentle sadness that made the woman look away. Harrison wasn't ready to concede. "Recorded backing track," he shouted to the sound crew. "Cut all the microphones. Let's see how she sounds without electronic help." The sound technician, a young man with multiple piercings and a reputation for honesty, shook his head. "Sir, there's no backing track. That's all acoustic." "Then prove it," Harrison demanded. "Play something technical." "Real pianists can handle complex polyrhythms." Margaret nodded once, then shifted her approach. Her left hand established a steady 3-beat pattern, while her right countered with groups of 2, the conflicting rhythms creating a hypnotic tension that defied easy listening. She added grace notes that sparkled like dewdrops, then transitioned into a cascading run that seemed to tumble down the keyboard like water over stones. The music critic for the Tribune, a woman known for her harsh reviews and encyclopedic knowledge, leaned forward in her seat. "Those are conservatory-trained hands," she whispered to her companion. "Graduate level, possibly professional." "But who is she?" her companion asked. The elderly man with the program had found what he was looking for. His phone screen showed a newspaper photo from 15 years ago. A young woman in a simple black dress, her hands poised over a piano, her face radiant with joy. The headline read, "Margaret Chen wins international piano competition." "Margaret Chen," he breathed, the program falling from his lap, "but she disappeared years ago. After her mother's accident, she sold everything to pay the medical bills. No one knew what happened to her." Sarah heard him, her tray clattering as she nearly dropped it. "Margaret Chen," she repeated, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "My music teacher used to play her recordings for us." She said Margaret was destined to be one of the greatest. The revelation spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Phones came out again, but this time to search for information rather than mock. The woman who'd sneered about school recitals found herself staring at video after video of Margaret's past performances, each one a masterpiece of technical perfection and emotional depth. Margaret seemed oblivious to the whispers. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. She placed it on the music stand, a picture of an older Asian woman smiling at a piano, her hands gentle on the keys. "For Mom," Margaret whispered, so softly that only Sarah could hear. The music that followed transformed the room. Margaret's fingers found melodies that seemed to unlock something in each listener's heart. A lullaby that spoke of unconditional love, a march that celebrated quiet courage, a waltz that mourned what was lost while celebrating what endured. A businessman in the corner found himself thinking of his daughter, estranged for 5 years, over words that seemed so petty now. A socialite remembered her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking, and the sound of old hymns hummed in a cracked voice. A waiter recalled his first day at work, how scared he'd been, how a kind customer had left an extra tip with a note that said, "You're doing great." The tears came slowly at first, then in earnest. Sarah wept openly, her uniform damp with tears. The businessman pulled out his phone, not to record, but to call his daughter. The socialite touched the simple wedding ring she still wore beneath her expensive jewelry. Even the harsh music critic felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of beauty so pure it bypassed all intellectual analysis. Margaret's playing grew softer, more intimate, as if she were playing for each person individually. The melody became a conversation, asking questions that only the heart could answer, offering comfort that words could never provide. When she finally let the last note fade into silence, the ballroom felt changed. The same people sat in the same chairs, but the air itself seemed different, charged with possibility and heavy with truth. Harrison stood in the silence, his face cycling through emotions he couldn't name. The signed contract in his pocket suddenly felt like lead. The lawyer beside him cleared his throat. "The terms were clear, Mr. Blake. $100,000 to the charity if the entire room cried." He looked around at the tear-stained faces, the discarded handkerchiefs, the red-rimmed eyes. "I'd say those conditions have been met." Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Around him, board members who'd watched the entire spectacle began to murmur among themselves. His reputation, built on ruthless deals and calculated cruelty, lay in ruins around his feet. Margaret stood from the piano bench, her worn jacket seeming suddenly regal in the chandelier's light. She walked to Sarah, who stood frozen with wonder and recognition. "What's your full name?" Margaret asked gently. "Sarah Williams," the young woman managed through her tears. Margaret took a pen from Harrison's lawyer and wrote on the back of a napkin, Sarah Williams Music Scholarship Fund. She handed it to the lawyer with a nod. The money goes here. For kids who can't afford lessons. Sarah's sob echoed through the silent ballroom. A security guard who'd been watching from the edges stepped forward. He was a large man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent working. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "I heard you play once before. About 10 years ago, at St. Mary's Shelter, you played Christmas carols for us folks who had nowhere else to go." Margaret's eyes found his, and recognition flickered there. "I remember you," she said softly. "You requested Silent Night." The guard nodded, tears threatening his own composure. "You made that old upright sound like heaven?" "I never forgot it." The crowd watched this exchange with a mixture of shame and wonder. Here was proof that Margaret's gift had never truly been hidden. She'd simply chosen to share it with those who needed it most. As the evening wound down, as the contracts were signed and the charity received its unexpected windfall, Margaret gathered her backpack and prepared to leave. The crowd parted before her now, not with mockery, but with something approaching reverence. Sarah caught up with her at the door. "Where will you go?" Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her worn features. "There's a community center on the south side. They have an old piano that needs tuning. I thought I might help with that." She paused at the threshold, looking back at the glittering ballroom one last time. The Steinway sat silent on its stage, waiting for the next performance, but Margaret had already given hers, and it was complete. Outside, the December air bit sharp and clean. Margaret pulled her jacket closer and walked into the night, her footsteps echoing off the empty sidewalks. Behind her, the Crystal Palace ballroom continued to glow, but its light seemed somehow changed, as if touched by something that couldn't be bought or sold or possessed. 3 blocks away, at St. Vincent's Community Center, an old, upright piano waited in a room that smelled of coffee and hope. Margaret would find her way there, as she always did. And tomorrow, children would gather around that piano to learn that music wasn't about perfect instruments or expensive venues. It was about the courage to make something beautiful in a world that often forgot how to listen. In the ballroom, Sarah carefully folded the napkin with the scholarship fund written on it, her hands still trembling from what she'd witnessed. She'd seen many performances in her young life, but none that had reminded her so powerfully why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Harrison Blake quietly resigned from the charity board the next morning. The fashion blogger who'd mocked Margaret found her social media flooded with comments reminding her of kindness. The teenager who'd live-streamed the encounter donated his phone to a shelter and signed up to volunteer. And somewhere in the city, in a warm room filled with the laughter of children learning to play, Margaret Chen sat at an old piano and made music that mattered. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was paying, but because the world needed beautiful things, and she had beautiful things to give. The melody continues in practice rooms and concert halls, in shelters and community centers, wherever someone sits down at a keyboard and chooses to create rather than destroy. Margaret's story became legend, not because she was perfect, but because she proved that worth isn't measured in applause or recognition. It's measured in the choice to keep playing, even when no one seems to be listening, especially then.